My presentation here is removing the snake oil from your program. This isn't to make fun of product vendors or anything like that, but I'm going to give you an honest impression of what I see from an attacker side standpoint of view. My name is Anthony Blakemore. I go by Tony. I originally started out as a developer in my career, and quickly as a developer I found out that I'm very good at attacking applications and networks and things of that nature. So I've been in this industry for 10 years now, and most recently I started a company called Direct Defense, not to be confused with this business card on the floor that was Digital Defense. So they have a very similar name, but that's no problem because there's only so many domain names that are kind of interesting. But formerly I was with some other consulting firms that you guys are probably more familiar with, which is Accuvant, and which is now Optiv, and NeoHapsis, which is now Cisco. So you can see that all these small security companies got bought up, joined together, and now we're dispersing again and creating a bunch of other small consultancies. So the agenda for today is we're going to be covering SIM, what is failing in the SIM world, endpoint protection. Are we really still trusting our systems with antivirus that doesn't really work? Network monitoring and intrusion detection. What's out there and what do you guys still have that could be improved upon? And patch management and configuration management. What are the success stories? What's still failing out in that world? Really, this is, like I said, not to make fun of product vendors, because every product has a purpose, and sometimes they can be implemented effectively. Other times they fail, and there's a lot of reasons for that failure. So a little bit background. Where are we at these days? The sadder part of this is breach detections are around 200 days before they're being detected. That's coming from the TrustWave or the Verizon breach detection report. In fact, they place it at a higher number, but we're in the 200-day range, and that's pretty much unacceptable. And it's shocking to think that if you look at a perspective, could you detect someone in your house, and how long would that take? Well, we're not detecting anybody in our workplace, so what's that saying about us? And 85% of that detection is coming from external sources. That's from government agencies that might come up and say, you guys really got to get a third-party auditor in here, or assessor in here, to look at what's happening. Or it's their partners that say, you guys got systems on your network that are attacking our network. What's going on over there? So obviously, things are not being discovered from an internal perspective, but more so on an external. Why do attacks keep working? Well, we're not able to see things clearly. And when we do see things, we're not sure what they're actually doing. So a lot of times, when I do an attack simulation with my customers, oftentimes they'll say, oh yeah, we saw your traffic. We saw your testing, your penetration testing. I said, oh, really? What did you see? Most of the time it was like, we saw, Nmap, or we saw some ping attacks. And I go, well, did you really see me, or did you just see some general traffic that I was throwing at you? And then at that point, what did you see after the fact? That's usually where they get lost. Once this breach actually occurs, what happened after the breach? What happened after that first step into the doorway? So a little overview of how attacks were, the life cycle of attacks. Or initially, in the early days of security world, people would just target users. That could have been phone calls, phishing, things of that nature. What's your password? And people would reply back nicely with their password. The second phase was the unprotected servers. That would have been the days where people had telnet that was exposed to the internet with default passwords or no passwords at all. It's a really interesting period when I couldn't believe people were paying us to do pen tests when they didn't change their passwords from what's in the manual. That moved into, the patching world where all the exploits were coming from systems that just didn't have the latest and greatest security updates. Also configuration issues where, administrative interfaces were exposed to the internet, just disclosing wealth of information to the end user. And those attacks were, again, very simplistic, but, not where we're at today. Today the external network is looking a little bit better, but we quickly traversed as attackers to the application world. Web applications were, not looked at as closely as they should. A lot of the rationale behind that at the time of was, this application is something that we only use a small portion of the time, or that application is only used by 4 of our users. Well, it's out to the internet, or it's on your internal network. You should still look at it because that's just the first point of attack. It may not be the ultimate goal, but it's our entry point. And then we kind of get back into the full circle thing, where we're going against the end user again. And these are targeted attacks, and they're usually sophisticated phishing attacks, malware deployments, things of that nature, which a lot of the major breaches of recent are all from malware and phishing, and that usually gets the entry point into the company. And once they get there, they start pivoting across your internal network. So, like I said, this is about removing snake oil. We're going to be talking about network security and monitoring right off the bat. Let's click there. The first dilemma is the firewalls. We are still looking from the ingress point of view, oftentimes. The reason I say this is my customers are, still talking about the ingress traffic. You've got to be talking about the egress traffic, stuff going outbound. What is being generated. We'll get into this a little bit later, but on a recent attack, again, we got into the internal network through external sources, and we were just moving tons of data out their door. They kept saying, well, we didn't see you. Well, of course you didn't see me because it's coming from the inside out, and you need to start looking at that. The second aspect of this is not placing enough firewalls throughout the network. Really, they should be placed in respected groups so that we can get good visibility and good protection between those zones. And then finally, the lack of visibility, like I always say, can you actually see what is occurring and why it's occurring? It's funny that we still could link this, need for visibility in the IT troubleshooting world, as well as the security world. So oftentimes when people are troubleshooting a problem, they say, well, I can look at it over on this side of things, and I can look over on this side of things, and there's a huge gap in between. It's kind of like, well, this hotel is all in, we have, maybe 200 rooms, but you don't know which room pulled the fire alarm if you have no sensors throughout that zone or blockades. So what should we want from the next generation of firewalls? Or that would be visibility, seeing what you can actually, what's actually being generated on your network, specifically applications. When you think about the Internet of Things, which is a new coined word, or phrase that I don't really appreciate, but most of that traffic is all HTTP and HTTPS. So that's your, let's think Samsung TVs. That's going to be all HTTP, HTTPS. That's your mobile phones. Most of all those apps are just doing web service calls. It's just a huge, vast opening of traffic that can't be placed in a protocol or can't be dissected in a protocol of which app is doing what traffic. That's why you need that good visibility to see what's generating that traffic. Network segmentation. As I state, it's time for zero trust models, basically reducing the level of access of their network capability based on their function. The new generations of firewalls are allowing us to do this, kind of like in the day of beginnings of databases. There weren't granular privileges, and surprisingly, big data is moving away from granular privileges, so all the advantages that we gained over time by really confining the amount of access that you had to a data record is starting to go away. But we should be confining that data so that if there is an event or an incident that occurs, that it can't traverse across the whole network. And that's the scary part, is moving away from these things is not what we should be doing. We should be restricting it and being able to manage that restriction in an effective manner. And if you can't replace your solutions that you have, because everybody invested lots of money into these solutions and they all have lifespans, try to ad hoc fix that solution by providing additional content filterings that would give you visibility into what that traffic is being generated on the network. So the dilemma of IDSs and IPSs, why they fail, is some of them are still protocol-based, where you actually have to understand what the protocol is, dissect the packet, and see what's happening. More recently, and I can't say recently because this has been out there for over 10 years, is signature-based, like antiviruses. Why do those fail? Well, it only takes an attacker a few minutes to change their signature of their attack. So whether the IDS puts out a new signature to block the latest and greatest attack, well, the attacker is just going to change it in a few minutes, and then all of a sudden that signature is ineffective against that attack. And finally, the most important one, I think, is placement. Again, they're putting it on the perimeter. They're looking at traffic that should be stopped at the very nature, but they're not looking inside. I'm not saying that this is a universal problem, but I'm saying it's a problem that I've seen in a lot of pen tests for Fortune 100 and top Fortune 50 companies that are still not looking at that important internal traffic. Because where's all your secrets at? They're on the internal network, and there are very well attackers on your internal network, whether you know it or not. Whether it's a disgruntled worker, possibly somebody that has intent to, take over your industry. Say, for instance, a guy like me that starts my own business. Wouldn't that information be nice to, have a leg up on the competition? But, watching that traffic is very important on the internal side as much as the external. So the next generation of solutions that are out there can provide some great value to you. It provides context. Why did these things occur? What happened after the initial breach occurred? Because most of it starts with just something really simple, like we attacked a laptop. Great. Now that laptop, where did it go after that laptop was compromised? Did it hop over to the server farm? Did it start going to your network shares and just grabbing everything it could possibly grab and start sending it out? That's pretty important. That's actually what one of my most recent pen tests was doing, was just taking their hardened laptop, which was reduced privileges, and I had a little piece of malware on there, and I was pulling all their network share. Granted, that user had limited privileges to that user share. I was still pulling the data, and it was still sensitive at nature because it was a human resources employee folder, and I was able to get all their employee information. Then, let's see here. Let's go to the next one. So, the most easy way I can show this, I'm not selling anything here, guys, so if you don't like it, let it be. But this is the next generation intrusion detection system. It's called LightCyber. The great thing about LightCyber is it actually has actionable events for us, and it can see our attacks. Why? Because we've tested it. We've seen what it does. We've deployed it at our customers, and it has been able to see where we've traversed the network. It can immediately investigate things, as well as it's pretty simple to understand what is actionable right now. When it goes into the red mode, it's time to look at that system immediately because it knows for sure. And what is a red mode? I'm not even going to get into the details, but the red mode means I know for a fact that this system's been breached. I know it's got malware. I've already sent that malware off to be investigated. I have traced all the network traffic from this system to other systems and found out what it was doing over there. So a lot of times when we pivot off of an internal attack, we're jumping to another system. What do? You know, pass the hash, things like that, maybe steal some local credentials off the system. Well, it's going to start tracking all that stuff, and it's going to start seeing where it's going. And then once it does see that, if you supply it with the correct credentials, it will log in as a domain administrator, pull the malware off, send it off to be exported. It'll do a process list dump. It'll monitor the traffic. It will basically start your investigation process for you and then collect all that information. Why is this helpful? Well, it's not only just a tool that just, you know, got you to the first step in your process. It went down instead and finished step 2 and step 3. And that's a really nice thing about a tool that is effective. Opposed to just letting me know that I have a problem, it's actually starting to get you into figuring out what some of these things are doing. So you can see I put out a bunch of different activities that this tool is essentially performing for you right out of the gate. It's called LightCyber. LightCyber, and I think it's a funny name because it kind of sounds like lightsaber, but it's new, and I've seen great return on investment for some of my customers. In fact, a lot of them, we put it in cold before even testing begins, and the main point to take away here is always test what you implement and actually make sure it's doing something for you. If it's not doing anything for you, which I'll get into some later topics, it probably wasn't worth the investment. But we put it in cold into the network, and we were able to find 4 machines instantly that were communicating outbound. Luckily, they were just being used as a ware server, a phishing server. Surprisingly, there was a ware server still around, but a phishing bot and a couple other things that was pretty nasty, but they weren't actually going after some of the company information that you know, we were nervous about. Next up is patch management, configuration management. Talk has probably been had for decades on how to do this, but my little spin on this thing is if your patch management and configuration management is not effective at this moment, it's time to get in the game here. Your patching should be a limited engagement for an employee. It shouldn't take teams to, you know, consistently maintain these patches. Realistically, if you're spending probably more than 4 hours deploying the latest patch across your network, you might want to start looking into other time or improving on that automation, because we're not trying to create more work for the IT environment. We're trying to take away from that. As IT professionals, especially the developer side of things, we're always looking for a shortcut or to improve efficiency. So realistically, you should be continually honing that so that you can reduce that man-hour. You know, there's not enough security professionals, there's not enough IT professionals. You want to reduce the load as much as possible in some of these simpler cases. Now, people will have things to say about patching and make it a complex process, but it shouldn't be. There's a lot of things out there that make your job easier. You should also be understanding where that patching process is missing. So again, getting back to the testing, what are we missing in that patching process? So the standardization, I think the most successful things I've seen lately is people adopting flavors of, you know, operating systems and keeping consistency with that. Back in the day, everybody was installing whatever they had at the latest moment, and that made for a more difficult process in the patching management. But ultimately, we're seeing good coverage on the operating system and the primary applications. Still, not a shock. Secondary applications like Java, Adobe products, I have to throw them under the bus because they are notorious for a problem. But those are the biggest gaps in the coverage, is in that secondary level. That's usually the area in which guys like me attack. It's just great high adoption rates of these softwares, and everybody has it, and usually they're all outdated. In fact, from the development side of things, yeah, I can almost guarantee there's outdated Java on the network, because whatever development team built an application on Java 1.5, well, it's still out in the environment. And, it's time to, bring it up to speed on the latest and greatest. So a takeaway is, at Direct Defense, we have a product called Threat Advisor. We normalize all the vulnerability data for your organization and distribute it across your federation. So it's one way that we can provide value, and I'm not there to pitch that, but a takeaway from that is I get to see where the common elements are across all my clients in regards to patching or configuration management. But as you can see, that unfortunately the 0% are tough to understand, but 0% means there's so much significant stuff in the Windows and the Adobe world that the 0% don't really show up on the radar. But Java, huge one, and Apache Tomcat is also, I think, a little bit more significant than 0, but as you can see, there's a lot of patching problems still, and we would hope it would go away, but it still persists. Now, the standardization of your builds is important, because I can tell you when a customer of mine has a good standardization process, it really makes my job a lot more difficult. When they start to reduce the privileges on the machines, when they have all the event and logging enabled on the machines, you can tell that they've put in an immense amount of time. Can I get around it? Sometimes. But a lot of times it makes my job a lot more difficult, and me being a lazy person, it could just throw me off the scent a little bit in the attack overall. The reason why you should start to adopt it is because it's pretty easy when you start to do builds and things like that. And then when we talk about the cloud network, a lot of customers are adopting this model of creating one standardized build for that server, pushing it out, just deleting all the rest of them, deleting the ones that have already expired. So you can build out your servers with the gold standard. If you adopt something as easy as CIS standard, I think that's probably the most business-friendly standard out there. Some of the other ones become a little more complex because you have to understand what applications are going to break when you apply the hardest standard. But if you can configure these builds before you get out there, you know what you have, you know that it's locked down to how you wanted, and then you can go and test just that one build opposed to testing the whole environment at one time. The final one, as I had to point out, the legacy systems, get rid of them. Unfortunately, the financial sector things, which there might be some people in this room, are notorious for running the oldest browsers that you can possibly find. Usually it's because they have some kind of internal application that never went away. It's exceeded its life cycle and nobody's supporting it anymore. But they're still running this old browser with some old Java. And it's a mess because now instead of having a little problem, now you have a huge problem because now you have 35,000 employees all using old browsers. And those old browsers are easier for me to exploit and take over those laptops. And then those laptops pivot into your internal network. So what do I propose for this sticky little situation because those applications don't go away? Consider adopting like a program of like a remote desktop system like a Citrix, where that Citrix server has that one old browser that's needed, and direct your customer or your internal employees to that Citrix server. And then you can confine and constrain the scope of where the bad problem exists. So that's one way of doing it. There's other alternatives, but you want to ultimately constrain that big issue, which I really hope goes away soon. The next part is SIM products, which is a tough one to discuss because people will invest huge amounts of money and time into SIM products, and they do serve a purpose. They do take it personally when you point out deficiencies in SIM, but I'm just going to take it as this. Be easy with me and don't take offense to anything that I have to say. I'm just taking a stance on what an attacker would think of a SIM product. So why do SIMs fail most often? Is there's tremendous amounts of data that it collects. And that tremendous amount of data creates all this noise that you can't possibly sift through because you may have not tuned it. And we'll get into tuning, but when you collect a huge amount of garbage, it's going to be a huge amount of garbage. Most of the time, the SIMs don't live up to what the hype is, and there's a lot of failures that we can point out. Okay, I think I was thinking of the next slide first, but one of the big failures is commitment to SIMs. It's a complex system that requires the appropriate driver, let's say, and I'm going to put a car reference in here. If you have an F1 race car or a NASCAR and you put in an average driver, he's probably going to spin that car right off the road because he doesn't know what he's doing with it. I'm not saying that the operators of the sim are bad drivers, but they haven't had the amount of training behind the wheel. And that's the same case for sim, is they may have had the training, but they might not have the whole day to spend working on refining those tuning rules and things like that for the sim. So he's probably in a dual-purpose role. When he's managing the sim, he's probably pushing out patches. Well, he has not spent enough time on the sim because oftentimes as an attacker, like I was saying earlier in the conversation, they don't see our traffic. They don't see what we're doing wrong on the network. Or they'll see the first tipping point. They'll say, oh, the attacker just hijacked Tony's laptop. Well, they don't know what happened after I hijacked the laptop. They weren't able to discern what the traffic on the internal network that was harmful. I do say that SIMs were built for compliance, and the reason I say that is oftentimes products in the space, the highest adoption rates become when they're tied to a compliance. It's really tough to sell a security product that's not absolutely necessary for the organization. It's damn near impossible because there's no budget in there. So oftentimes they'll gear this product into a compliance product, forced of habit, because they will now make everything that they do in there so that it's easy for an auditor to work with. It might not be easy for an administrator to work with or a security operations center to work with, but it's really pointed for one direction. And that is something that it's a tough reality to swallow because they needed to sell their product and they needed to find their customer base. And when it was tied to compliance, well, now you have a bunch of customers that need to buy your product. Absolutely. Another aspect of SIM that is a common failure is people don't test it. They don't see, well, we know it's got all these rules in here that it's supposed to see the bad stuff on the network, but they never see, can I actually, identify where that's coming from? Or are we capturing everything? Or are we flagging the right traffic for the highest priority? You never know until you test. And most of the time, let's see here, most of the systems only log 35 to 45% of the data that you need by default. The reason I point this out is I'm going to throw a question out there. In Windows world, what is one of the most interesting events that Windows out of the box doesn't log? Successful login. So, when an attacker steals a hash or a password, you're not logging when he logs into 15 other workstations or 15 other servers. So out of the box, a lot of the systems and that data that's getting pushed to the SIM isn't actually capturing something that's manageable or eventful for a security operations team. I kind of cover it right here too. But also SIMs should be looking for things like brute force, horizontal movement. I used to use horizontal escalation, but it's kind of an oxymoron. It doesn't really make sense. But horizontal movement and escalation of privileges. There is a product out there. Again, not going to sell it to you. But StealthBits, watches out of the box. It looks at the Active Directory server and watches where all these events are occurring. And it does a very nice job of telling you where an attacker is moving through the network, or even possibly an employee that's doing something bad. Let's think of a popular topic in the data leaks, the info wars and things like that. Well, if I, as a user, am only pulling down 1 to 2 files off of a file share a day, and then all of a sudden I decide to pull down 15,000, well, you might want to go over to my desk and see what's happening, because it's probably an issue. And then the final thing, well, actually I don't think it's the final, but endpoint protection. Why does this fail? Well, because it's really easy to circumnavigate endpoint protection at the present time. This tool that I'm showing on the screen in this image is one of the popular malware tools that you can download from like a hacker forum. It basically builds your own payloads for command and control of servers. I've highlighted a couple things of interest. In this tool, it makes it so simple that I can choose anti-sandboxing, anti-VMware, anti-virtual PC, anti-Wireshark, and at the bottom, there's a delay mechanism. What do all these mean? Well, a lot of these protections are based on some simple rules. There's a couple solutions out on the market that say if an application that executes doesn't do anything harmful in the first 5 minutes, it's good. And that's a major brand out there. There's a few others that will do a sandbox approach, where if it gets a new executable, it'll run it in a sandbox. What do those sandbox have in common? Most of the time, they have one CPU core, or they'll have only 2 gigs of memory allocated to the machine. So as attackers, we know this, and we're going to make sure that, number one, it executes maybe in 15 minutes. Number 2, hey, everybody's laptop probably has 4 cores. If you go to Best Buy, it's probably going to be a 4-core machine or bigger, or it's going to have 8 gigs of RAM. So ultimately, we can just put in some checks to defeat those protections, and that's a sad reality. I'll tell you it afterwards. So most of the major breaches that have occurred in the recent years have all had some kind of malware that got them into the door. And then after that point, then it's been as easy as just setting up command and control servers or exfiltrating data just straight out the door. Again, not watching the egress traffic. You know, they're basically just sending stuff directly to their machines, their attacker machines. So testing your endpoint protection happens a lot, and we get to see all the failures. Signature-based solutions typically only catch 10% of the real malware. This isn't your drive-by attack malware. This is something that might be a little bit more sophisticated or targeted towards your company. The whitelisting approach only catches about 60% of the malware. The reason I'm stating this is because I get to see it. I get to deploy my malware. I get to see what their protections were in place. I can see even their host-based solution in the running processes. So I can see that it's still running and everything's, you know, happy. I've even taken screenshots of people's desktops with them basically clicking, you know, this program's okay, and letting it go right past the protection itself. So, not pitching the company, but I would suggest taking a look at maybe a video on YouTube. There's a company called Cylance that's a math-based solution. They don't have any signatures, the software doesn't update, and they don't push any of the malware actually to the cloud. They will push it to the cloud if you allow them to, so that you can do further analysis on it as to how it was, you know, really operating on your network. But Cylance is an interesting one because I know for a fact I can't beat it. So it does a calculation based on, you know, the application profile, what that application is aiming to do, and if enough bad elements add up in that actual malware, it says, you know what, you're out. And it's really, you know, helpful that you know, you don't need to be connected to the internet, because a lot of the software, if you haven't dug into it, all rely on connecting to the cloud, essentially. And what do? You know, first thing in the cloud is basically they go throw it over to VirusTotal and says, hey, does any other antivirus solution say this is bad? And then they kind of rely on it. And if you ever see any, you know, new malware out there, usually 1 or 2 will say it's bad. And then the second day, all of a sudden, all the rest of them have said it's bad now too, because they've updated their signatures based on that. So what does this look like when something bad happens? This is a tool, Cobalt Strike. It's a user interface to, basically Metasploit. But on this, we were testing a POS network, and we were able to compromise one of the hosts. And then one of those hosts, we basically ran our own memory scraper to pull out track 1 data, or track data off the credit cards. And I don't think I have a photo of it, but antivirus was running on the system. And, obviously nothing happening. Let's see here. So, not to make anybody feel bad, but during that test, Proofpoint was working, or running, didn't stop. FireEye was running, didn't stop it. Symantec was running, didn't stop it. They didn't see where we were coming from. They didn't see anything that we were doing until we told them. I'm not going to get into all the details here. I'll just let you kind of glance at them and take them at will, but I can tell you that that's what we've experienced in our test. Another one that I was doing, and again, I'm not picking on those companies because I could throw McAfee right there with Symantec. I could throw a lot of those companies all in this. It's all universal. But essentially that's what happened. Another thing that was interesting is malware doesn't have to do anything really harmful to the system to be bad. There was a big breach in Russia area that was a financial institution, and they estimate the loss of that breach was $300 million to $2 billion, which I don't know how you can get that big of a gap. But what that malware was doing was taking a screenshot of somebody's desktop every 15 seconds, hoping that they would get a user account name, some credit card information, some bank account information. And all that was doing was posting out that photo every 30 seconds. So is that bad for a malware company? No, to them it's just a screen picture. It's a screenshot tool. So it was just running all the time, and they were able to hijack all that information. So malware doesn't have to be as crazy as taking over a server and then just branching out and taking over the whole network. No, it can just be something as simple as that. Screenshotting something that's very important to the company. Just want to see what time we have. Oh, we're getting close. Okay, so this is kind of the wrap-up slide. The moral of my presentation is to start thinking about other solutions. If anything that I said resonated with you guys that you're having problems with, it's probably time to start looking at new technologies because they're out there. I've seen some actual gains in here in which me being a consultant, the first half of my career, my company wasn't even allowed to recommend a product. So in our testing, we weren't even allowed to say that that was a solution. We always tried to find solutions that could be programmatically done or built in-house because we were so adverse to pushing. The second half certainly was more in the lines of let's push solutions out there. And I'm just kind of telling you that finally at this point in time there are some solutions that would probably make my job more difficult as a pen tester or an application tester. So if it's making me actually work harder at some of these activities, then maybe you should explore some of those opportunities out there because they certainly are worthwhile. With that said, I'm going to open it up for questions if there are any, and then I'll let you guys get home to your houses. Actually, I think there's a keynote speak. So, okay. So, anybody have any questions or want to pick my brain about something? Yeah. Right. Yeah. Certainly. In all those solutions that I mentioned probably should be thought about in your life cycle. When are you going to replace some of these solutions that you currently have? But as you said, like the patch management and the configuration management, as long as refining it and putting more focus on that from a employee and process point of view, absolutely. And that's why I was pointing out in the patching management discussion, really, we're there to reduce time. You know, we should always be reducing time. If we're not reducing time and time's expanding as far as that activity that we're performing, we should be thinking about it again and saying, is this the best solution that we have in place? Is this the best process in place? And why is this growing in magnitude? Simply adding, let's put it in this term. If we add 1,000 more workstations and that skews our patch management's timeline by a week, we probably have an issue. So that's where I was going with that. And I think that might directly answer your question, but if it didn't, let me know because I can go further. Like I said, one of the financial institutions that I tested, most of their laptop builds and configurations and the least privilege access that they implemented was a big initiative. It took them a lot of time. But boy, oh boy, that made my job very difficult because I was at the lowest point in the totem pole. And it really made it tough to traverse or stay persistent in that internal network. And that didn't cost that much money. You know, that was just man hours. And man hours do cost money, but that's a good cost, you know. So, back there. Oh. That's a tough one. I don't know if I can give you a balance on that because each case would be limited based on the resources available. So in a lot of cases, I will see that their security or IT operations department is so limited staff that even if they had the best item in place, it wouldn't have been looked at ever. And alternatively, I've seen, you know, tons of security folks, but didn't, like you said, hold to the discipline of what they were doing. They're more excited about looking at the latest and greatest technology and not actually learning how to implement it. And I think that kind of goes back to that race car analogy of really, you know, you could have the best thing in the world and it's worthless, you know. Let me get a little more thought, and maybe I'll have an answer for you when I walk out. I don't know. I mean, I don't know if I have a direct answer to that yet. Yep, back there. I haven't looked at bit 9 too much, but I can tell you that a lot of my customers have trouble with the whitelisting approach because if they're in the manufacturer space, they're going to be dealing with programs that were custom built internally. And they're going to look like a lot like malware because they're going to do something that's very similar to a malware approach. And they start getting a little whitelist happy and you know, kind of letting the policy lax. So I think that, I'm trying to think of what I want to say to that. I think it's the middle of the road. So whitelisting is a better solution than blacklisting with a signature base, but it's not ultimately going to stop a sophisticated attack. And I think that's all that I can rest upon is from the point of clicking that malware, it's not going to probably stop all of them. And that's the ultimate goal here is to really stop all of them, or at least have a good grasp on that. It's just too often that I've seen our stuff get by it, that I think it's, if I'm capable of it, and I'm not spending all day long constructing a single attack against a customer, then somebody else is going to get by it. Most of my engagements last 2 to 4 weeks, so I have to be pretty agile and get everything out the door as quick as possible. And if I can defeat all these protections in 2 to 4 weeks, then think about what somebody's going to do in a year or longer. So, yep.
In your engagements, are you running into any enterprise customers that are following a perfect patching approach, where they're just basically sending the updates out and focusing less on testing?
I have seen some pretty good in the high 90s percentile of patching, so like maybe missed 4, 12 hosts out of a huge slew of them. That seems to be the case, but I do see still a problem of people excluding certain software, certain applications. Like the customer I was thinking about that was very proficient on patching left the big gaping hole of the bad browser. So they were totally patched on the operating system. Everything was looking good, but the browser was terrible. So what does that say? We've taken away this entry point, but we've left this easier one out there. I do see that people are improving on patching. I think it's something that is maintained a little bit better than what it used to be, even, say, 5 years ago. So, yep. Yeah. No, they're isolating. They're putting them in a quarantine. They're blocking all services because how many times have you got the latest and greatest printer that has all these features, but you say, you know what, I'm going to scale back all the features. I'm going to disable this. I'm going to disable SNMTP, or I'm going to disable SSH from it. As soon as you disable those printers sometimes become useless. I've done it personally. I've said, I'm going to turn everything off except for, something that it needs. And as soon as I did, it didn't do anything. It wouldn't print, it wouldn't scan, it wouldn't do anything. So what people are doing is just putting them in a quarantine, their own little network, and putting the proper ACLs to block every port that should be blocked and just allowing the one that should, as well as restricting access based on, user group and things like that. So, but that's a quandary. I mean, they're being installed with, Apache. They're being installed with every single piece of software on that printer that you wonder, how am I ever supposed to maintain that? And as of right now, I can say the easiest way to maintain it is isolation and blocking from bad things. So, but the printer problem is an interesting one. And then also the good thing about doing the isolation is oftentimes when we do like a physical security or an internal test, they might have NAC and they might have all these security protections on their internal VLAN, but as soon as you unplug the port on the printer and plug your own laptop in it, you've all of a sudden bypassed all those security protections that they had, because the printers were off in their own world and we don't need NAC on a printer and all this kind of stuff. And sure enough, as soon as you plug into it, you have the whole network to yourself with no restrictions. So if you put it in an isolation mode, kept off in their own quarantine, now I can't use that printer port to get it anywhere else in the network. And that would be fantastic. Yep. That one's going to be the dedication of the manpower and proper training. I mean, the solution's there. The problem with it is because it's still a compliance requirement. We can't just say, well, we're going to just use this tool instead of doing a full SIM type of product. Really tuning those rules and getting somebody fully dedicated to it, because a lot of those breach statistics, like the 200-day thing, the SIM actually found it. they saw all the breach. They saw the initial breach. They just didn't do anything about it. And that's the frustrating part is, again, they had a really good solution in place. They weren't tuned, and they weren't watching. Yeah. I think so, because you still need it centrally and backed up and centrally located and be able to get through all that data. So I think it's still an adequate solution. I'm gonna think about that one too. I mean, I don't have a good answer for you as far as like what I would do, but some of the other protections or other areas, I would put more time onto them, just because. And this, keep in mind, this is all from detecting the bad guy. I would keep my eyes elsewhere, but it's still necessary. So yeah, that's pretty much it. Yep.
So, say,
yeah. Yep. Usability is an interesting one. I always try to strike the balance. So I'm mainly in the application side of things. I know if I get my way with some of my recommendations, that application will be difficult to use. One of my customers is a healthcare provider, and they say basically like, if you do anything more complex than a username and password, we're not going to have customer base at all. So I always try to strike a balance and find other solutions that won't stop but deter or slow down potential attacks, and then making it a visible action so that somebody watching it could do something about it. So what I'm thinking about in this particular case is, because everything has a case behind why I'm saying it, is like an authentication mechanism was brute forceable by anyone as an attacker. I said, well, let's do some tight lockout procedures. Let's do some CAPTCHA and some other things. But when I started getting into it, they said, oh no, you're doing too much, nobody's going to use it. So eventually we got down to an approach that was soft enough that would slow down somebody bad like me to something that would make an attack that would take less than an hour into something that's going to take maybe a week, that kind of thing. So that give-take is essential. And do you have a particular use case that I could try to leverage to answer this? Because I think that would help me try to get something more pointed, and I don't like to talk in generalities, so I'll try to get it pointed. By the way, I hope this is done recording so that I can really say what I think. But what's happening? Yep. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, you got to find where the pain point is for them, and use that to your advantage. So if the pain point is for that particular customer, let's say they don't like to be publicized in the media. Let's say your company is very private. use that as the pain point and say, find some reason to push that pain point into driving them to your direction. It's not like blackmail, but it's saying, okay, you guys don't want to be in the media, but let's look at the cases in which people have shown up in the media that could be as a result of this, and then kind of steer them that way. I've dealt with some creative type companies that thought that the company should be wide open and everybody should share and everything's free. And I said, well, let's think about this. Do you want everybody to have your social security number? No. Well, why don't you want them to have it? Well, because that's my information. I said, okay. Well, then, if we're supposed to be free, your information's on that HR person's laptop right over there. They could go get it, through an attack, or just, somehow she left her laptop unlocked. So if we're in this happy, wide open environment, what's preventing me from going over to her computer and just, looking at it? And they said, nothing. I said, well, that's why, companies are compartmentalized. They have offices. Sometimes there's lock and key. And I think if we're talking about this, we have to basically say we need to compartmentalize our network just like an office building would have. And we've overlooked those compartmentalization aspects in an office building because now a lot of things are big cubicles. Well, there was a reason why we had office spaces that were private. It was so that, the IT guy reciting somebody's password because they forgot it over the phone isn't overheard by, somebody that doesn't dislike them, 2 cubes away, which could happen. So ultimately, that's kind of where we have to head is, number one, find what the motivating factor is for that business, and then using it to your advantage to persuade them to change. Yes. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
When you do a pen test engagement, do you strike the balance between a full security assessment versus trying to reach the environment? When do you consider your job done? Do you go after high coverage? Do you showcase here's all your exposures? Or I got in?
Yeah, try to set up some goals before the engagement starts. That's what we usually do. So find out what's the crown jewel of the organization and what to achieve with that. So there's always a balance between some customers want, the true attack, and oftentimes they're not ready for the true attack. Sometimes they're just ready for a simulated attack or something that's like, I'm going to exploit a few things and show you that this is possible. It goes back to that discussion over there that it's what your company needs to see. So some people don't believe vulnerabilities until they're exploited. Okay, all right, if we're going to do that, now we have to exploit everything on that pen test to show that that's true. Other companies will say, if you find it, don't do anything. We understand. We'll go fix it right now.
I find like a lot of people think that they're not exploitable. And
yes.
You go do a waste project with a pen test, you're back to doing now let's do a high coverage assessment, right?
Yep. Then it goes back to the high coverage.
Yeah,
like, you didn't find everything.
Yeah.
Totally happens. But the crown jewel thing is the most important because, like you said, if you're doing a real attack, if you don't know what that crown jewel is, like I could steal everything that I think is important, but if that's not really what they're nervous about, like let's say I take all the customer invoices from the company and it's got all their details of who their customers are and all this kind of thing. If that's not the crown jewel, maybe the crown jewel was intellectual property and I didn't steal any schematics. Well, there you go. Now we didn't prove a point. They said, well, you didn't get to the schematic section. Well, I didn't know that was important to you guys. So that's a good one. I mean, so. Yeah, because like I was saying, the entry point could happen through so many different vectors. There's so many different ways possibly in. And let's say, basically everybody's laptop, let's call that a vector because it is. They connect to public Wi-Fi and they bring it back to the office and then all of a sudden it's a mess. But if we can compartmentalize inside with more firewalls, now this one mess, instead of being the entire company's problem, could be 25 computers' problem. So, because you'd be confine that 25 set of, and keep in mind when I say firewalls, I mean also access control lists and things like that to confine it more. So. That's dependent on the company. That's a lot of different views. Even when my product like Threat Advisor, we break down data based on geographic locations, business groups, business units. It depends on what that organization thinks of when they break down their teams or their infrastructure. So some people like to think in the world of office buildings. Other people like to think of, well, that's HR department. They're separate. But HR department could be multiple buildings, you know. So yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yep. Sure thing. No problem. Here, I'll turn this off here. With the